Hello, everyone. This is Danny Haiphong. We have a packed stream today, and I only have about an hour to complete it. So I want to get started. If you are joining the stream now, please do like the stream. Please do share the stream, subscribe to the channel, hit that notifications bell. And of course, if you are able to support this work, you can do so at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. And I'll repeat that a few times throughout the stream, but I have about an hour and I want to get started. So hello, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Monday. I am coming to you to talk about, yes, that is Joe Biden's speech in Poland given a couple of days ago after many a meeting with their so-called European allies, the Biden administration's so-called European allies. The apex of this was the NATO summit. And of course, this speech in Warsaw was the icing on the cake, because what everyone is talking about right now is whether Joe Biden's so-called gaffe was a gaffe at all. And what was this gaffe? Well, this gaffe was a reference to Putin as being someone who cannot remain in power. That's what Joe Biden said, giving a lot of pundits, commentators from across the spectrum, whether independent media analysts, anti-war activists, and of course the mainstream media itself, wondering, did Joe Biden mean to say that the United States is interested in regime change? Of course, Joe Biden is walking back these comments. The administration is saying they have absolutely no intention of conducting regime change. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has said that there is no strategy for regime change in Russia. And I'm going to show you a few reasons why this is just not true. So first, just let me know how I sound. How is my audio? Is someone saying that I'm low? Asha, does that continue to be true? Just let me know. But I'm now going to put up exactly what I mean when I reference Joe Biden's speech in Warsaw, the speech in Poland, which everyone is talking about. So let me pull that up really quickly so you all know what I mean. So Joe Biden, while you're doing this, Joe Biden makes a lot of mistakes, and he makes them often. So we can't always know whether his mistakes are some sort of Freudian slip, or just because of his cognitive decline, or some mixture of both. But nonetheless, it is important to, I think, analyze this further. And I have a few things I want to show you which indicate that actually the United States is waging a war of regime change on Russia, and this has been ongoing for many years. But first, let's get to the speech. So here's a transcript of President Biden's speech in Warsaw on Russia's quote unquote invasion of Ukraine. So he gave this speech a couple of days ago, and I'm just going to scroll to the end because that's where this happened. There's a lot of words here. I think we can predict what he was saying, talking about unity with NATO allies, going on and on about Russia, going on and on about the heroism of the Ukrainian people. We can go on and on and on about that. So here is what he says, and I'll just read you the full paragraph that goes into his reference to regime change. So Joe Biden says, a dictator, he means Vladimir Putin, bent on rebuilding an empire will never erase a people's love for liberty. Brutality will never grind down their will to be free. Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia, for free people refuse to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principle, hope, and light. I mean, this is just nauseating. This is just American exceptionalist, imperialist garbage. But he says, of decency and dignity, freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. God bless you all. And may God defend our freedom, and may God protect our troops. All that similar, very familiar jazz that we hear people like Joe Biden say when they are trying to give a speech promoting American exceptionalism. But this is what he says. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. And he's directly referencing Vladimir Putin. So, of course, people are going to wonder, hey, do you mean that regime change is what you are pursuing, Joe Biden? And it's a good question, and we should be asking the question. And I'm here to answer that question for you. So, welcome to the stream, everyone. Welcome to the video. Please like it, share it, subscribe to the channel, hit the notifications bell, and subscribe to support my work at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. But keep liking the stream, help boosting this stream in the algorithm. And I will now go into exactly what Biden means when he talks about, oh, this man cannot remain in power, right? And so he's talking about Vladimir Putin. He went on a 20, 30-minute diatribe against Russia and Putin for its intervention in Ukraine, and then ends it with this idea that Vladimir Putin is not a legitimate leader in Russia and that he cannot remain in power. So we should give some context. We should understand exactly why Joe Biden could say such a thing. And that's because there is actually an effort at regime change against Russia led by the United States. And now, this effort is not necessarily spoken loudly by the powers that be. You could find articles in a foreign policy magazine saying the United States needs to wage a two-pronged war, a war against both China and Russia, but they'll never say that the government itself needs to be overthrown directly. And I believe there are a few reasons for this. For one, the likelihood of a successful regime change operation in Russia led by the United States is actually very small right now. There isn't a real likelihood that the United States is going to succeed in regime changing Russia and actually overthrowing Putin and the United Russia Party. The opposition is very weak. The right-wing opposition that the U.S. supports is very weak. So it's very unlikely. It's also very unlikely that the kind of war that is needed in order to achieve such an objective is possible right now. The United States would plunge if we think that these sanctions alone and what it's doing to the global capitalist economy are one thing. Just think about the kind of war that the United States would need to wage in order to actually have a successful regime change operation in Russia. It just doesn't seem fathomable because the ruling class is interested in reproducing itself, so there is some hesitation about going all in. Russia's military operation just wasn't enough for the United States to consider a full-scale military operation directed at Russia, and I don't see one on the way. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that regime change isn't part of the overall strategy. It doesn't mean that it isn't the overall aim against Russia. And this has multiple facets to it. Any kind of sanctions regime, number one, is an operation for regime change. Sanctions are meant to bleed governments dry, to bleed countries' economies dry, to make them submit to the will of imperialism. And if they don't, then hopefully, as the United States and European powers have said over and over again, hopefully this puts pressure to bear on the government and the people will rise up. This is not something that they hold their tongues about. They want sanctions to produce unrest in the country that they are leveling them against. And so that's usually coupled with something that also exists in Russia, which is a large amount of foreign sponsored funding for opposition figures. The United States funds opposition groups in Russia, funds so-called civil society groups in Russia. And let me just give you an idea about how deep this funding goes. So the National Endowment for Democracy makes it really easy. They don't always make it easy to calculate the total amount. So I'm not even going to try here because it's a lot of money and we're not going to add it up. But let's just say that there are millions of dollars circulating for so-called civil society groups, so-called democratic opposition, et cetera, the Navalny's of the world, right? These forces are receiving millions of dollars to wage essentially regime change in Russia, to pressure the government to change its particular form and leadership. So I'm going to show you now the National Endowment for Democracy's page for 2021 Russia and just how much money is going into these kind of operations, right? Into these kind of so-called legitimate democratic struggles. So here you have it. I don't know if you can see that. I think I made it a little too big. Let me make it a little smaller for you. So, Russia 2021, this was published just last month. The funders, all of the different funders for opposition groups in Russia and so called opposition movements. So, here you have $355,000 by the National Democratic Institute, the NDI. Who was the chair of that? It was Madeleine Albright. So, you had the International Republican Institute, the IRI, putting in $900,000 for expanding the reach of Democratic actors, right? So over and over and over again, you have the NDI again, $385,000, right, for civic engagement and Russian-speaking partners. And so over and over and over again, you have $100,000 here for human rights monitoring. You have another $63,000 there. And this list is very long of sums above $100,000, $200,000 each, $55,000 grants. These are sort of efforts that the NED is funding. And so this tallies upwards of more than a few $1,000,000, right? I'm guessing that if we tallied this all together, we would get something for 2021 alone, $3 to $5 million at minimum. This list goes on and on and on and on and on and on. So I'm actually underestimating this. If I were to have tallied this whole thing up, we might actually get upwards of 5 to 10 million, just given some of these numbers. I mean, we're talking about 150,000 here, right? Supporting civil society, supporting independent media, 102,000 there. I mean, we are talking about large sums of money from the National Endowment for Democracy going to opposition forces that oppose the Russian government. So that is an indication. Both the sanctions, right, the sanctions regime against Russia and the internal opposition, which is backed by the United States, that's just an easy way to see that the United States is waging a campaign of regime change against Russia. The National Endowment for Democracy has a long record. Nicaragua, Syria, Ukraine, right? During this Russia-Ukraine conflict, the National Endowment for Democracy deleted all of its sponsorship and funding that was publicly available on its website. It scrubbed it from the website and deleted it because the NED knows, and it was founded in 1983 with the express purpose of doing what the CIA did covertly in public, right? That it would be a shame that the CIA would be associated with these so-called democratic movements, opposition movements, right? That there would be this kind of stain now that the CIA, after the Church Committee, after all the things that were found out about the CIA in the 1970s, it'd be a shame if these efforts that were being undertaken in the 1980s would be solely associated with the CIA. So that's what the NED is all about. And it has its hands everywhere, not just Russia, all the propaganda you hear about China, Uyghur human rights, Hong Kong, right? They funneled millions of dollars into the opposition in Hong Kong that was waging violent so-called riots in, well, they were called protests, quote unquote, but they were really riots in Hong Kong, 2019, 2020. So there is just a lot of evidence that the National Endowment for Democracy is a regime change arm of the United States government, of the military industrial complex, and that it is operating heavily inside of Russia and also outside of Russia to spread this propaganda, right? It's already spent, I believe, tens of millions of dollars alone just to propagandize against Russia during this military operation in Ukraine. So those are just a few indicators, right? And then there's the larger policy of the military encirclement of Russia. I mean, what do we think that really is all about? Now, there is hesitation to call the military encirclement of Russia, the NATO expansion on Russia's border, a regime change operation in Washington and the Pentagon, etc. But they do acknowledge that this is about geostrategic competition, what they call great power competition, right? That is the overall strategy since 2017 under Donald Trump, and it continues under Joe Biden, despite the fact that Joe Biden has tried to change the wording around a little bit. It's still the overall geopolitical strategy of the Pentagon, the so-called defense strategy of the Pentagon, to wage this great power competition, which is about expanding the military capabilities into Russia and China's so-called sphere of influence. Really, what that means is just all the way up to Russia's borders, all the way up to China's borders, to continue the dangerous buildup in Taiwan, military buildup in Taiwan, to continue the NATO expansion into Ukraine, which is what this whole Russia-Ukraine conflict is all about, right? So there is a lot of evidence that suggests that any kind of militarization taking part, that the United States takes part in, is actually all about regime change. The US military only does regime change. It is not a quote unquote defense institution. It isn't a department of defense, right? It is an offensive institution which has a long history, right? Decades, if not centuries worth of history, where the United States goes into countries, invades them, destroys them, plunders them, occupies them, wages proxy wars in them, and then sanctions them, etc., in order to get a government, in order to get a system, a state that complies with its diktats, that allows US capital to operate freely, completely without any restrictions from any government, right? And that is what the US military is about. That is why there are 400 military bases on China's doorstep. That's why NATO is on Russia's doorstep. This military encirclement campaign is about regime change, and we cannot forget it. So when Joe Biden says this man cannot remain in power, he's also speaking through the military, which also believes that. Do they believe that they can get it done now? Do they believe that their actions are actually going to succeed now? That's not so clear, right? Because the strategists in the Pentagon and the military industrial complex are not necessarily foolproof. They're not necessarily these kind of actors that always get their way. They know that the cards are kind of stacked up against them, and they have been. And you even saw Bloomberg Magazine recently say, oh, well, the dollar actually may go, but that might not be so bad. It may not be the biggest currency anymore because of this conflict. And so there's a strong feeling among US capital, among some of these mouthpieces of the war machine, that not everything is really going so well for the United States. But that doesn't change the fact that NATO expansion, military encirclement as a whole, that policy is about regime change, whether they even believe they can achieve it or not, short of a catastrophic war. So we have to take all of these factors into consideration. The proxy war, right? The covert war that is led by the National Endowment for Democracy. It's led by opposition groups that the United States backs, the sanctions, which are trying to starve the Russian economy into submission. And then, of course, the military policy, which is meant to pressure Russia into doing what it did here, which is come to the aid of East Ukraine. It's meant to generate a response. It's meant to intimidate Russia, to try to get Russia to back off, to shrink, right? And the same goes for China. It's to get these countries to think twice before coming to defense agreements, before coming to any cooperation agreements. It's all about intimidation, and that intimidation will hopefully lead to regime change according to the minds of these hawks that dominate Washington, D.C., Joe Biden included. So that's just kind of a basic analysis of how we should think about regime change against Russia. But I wanted to show you something that's very interesting. So, first published in the Moscow Times, but republished in the Rand Corporation. There's a very interesting article written about a week before Joe Biden gave this speech. It was March 18th, 2022. And I want to show you exactly how these hawks, these anti Russia hawks, think. Okay. So this is the Rand Corporation. This is a huge think tank of the Pentagon. And I'll show you exactly how deeply connected they are to the war machine in a second. But this is William Courtney, and he wrote in the Moscow Times, which is a mouthpiece of the United States, supposedly in Russia, but actually is not located in Russia anymore. I believe it's in Amsterdam. It is a pro-Russia opposition outlet. It is very reactionary, very anti-Russia, yet it's called Moscow Times. But this was republished in Rand Corporation's blog if regime change were to come to Moscow. So William Courtney is thinking about regime change in Moscow, right? This is the mindset and the mentality of these warmongers. They are thinking about this, they are strategizing about it, they are trying to frame the narrative and propagandize about it so that people will believe that this is something that's possible. So here, William Courtney says that strains in Russia over the war in Ukraine and punishing economic sanctions could spark regime change in Moscow. First sentence. Although prospects for this are uncertain, as I was saying, and how the establishment feels about this, the West might be prudent to begin considering with how to deal with any new government. Past disruptions in Russia may offer some insights into for Western policy, but new ground may need to be plowed. So he just goes over how Mikhail Gorbachev, there's a failed putsch against him in 1991 by the Politburo, and then there was a Soviet collapse. And then, of course, Boris Yeltsin was the US's guy in Russia, plundered the economy. And then he talks about the security sector's influence has helped lead to wars in Chechnya, obsessive espionage, stifling of political opposition, invasions of Ukraine and Georgia, right? So he's talking about how the security sector is still a huge problem for the United States when thinking about regime change. In the 3 decades since Russia's modern independence, repression at home and aggression abroad have never been greater than now. This may seem to in part reflect the dominance of today's Kremlin by security sector veterans. So these are the leaders, he is saying, who are posing a problem to regime change. Unless the security sector is reformed, efforts by any new Russian leaders to open politics and improve relations with the West could falter. The West might consider using some of its sanctions as leverage to encourage security sector reform. So, literally, he is saying, William Courtney, and I'll tell you who William Courtney is in a second, he is saying that regime change could come to Russia and that this is something that's desirable. But let me just point out some problems with this potential scenario. What's the biggest problem with a new leadership emerging in Russia? It's the military, it's the security sector. And now he's saying that the United States and Europe should leverage their sanctions against the security sector, which basically means that you are attempting at regime change here, that you should encourage this new leadership to come about. So if new Kremlin leaders, if they were to emerge, may need time to make changes, right? So he goes into all of the different reasons for that during the late period of the Soviet Union, right before its fall. So that is basically a lot of this article, right? Talking about the Soviet collapse, learning lessons, right? Engaging in new leaders can pay dividends. President Bill Clinton developed a measure of trust with the mercurial Yeltsin, showing patience even when he invaded Chechnya. In return, Clinton obtained his acquiescence in other areas of importance, such as NATO matters. So, if you essentially cultivate leaders that will work for you, then you can get what you want, essentially saying that this current government in Russia is not what you want, and we need someone more like Yeltsin, and we need to behave more like we did during the period of Yeltsin once new leaders in Russia emerged. So this is just a whole indication, right? A whole indication that this is actually a regime change project. So who is William Courtney? Because we don't need to get into, he's a reactionary. We don't need to get into the whole article, but those words alone show exactly what I mean. So William Courtney is an adjunct senior fellow at the nonpartisan nonprofit Rand Corporation. And so he was a U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan, Georgia, USSR, and the USSR negotiations to implement the 3 threshold test ban treaty. But is that all who he is? Is that who William Courtney is? Let's see. So William Courtney is not just some kind of former ambassador. He actually served. So not only is he a big part of the Rand Corporation, right? He served as where is it? So he So William Courtney, so he's all these things, right? He's the Rand Business Leaders Forum, the director of that Rand Corporation. He's a senior fellow there. Um, he's a former member, blah, 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 blah. Here we go. This is what I want to hear. So he belongs to the Council on Foreign Relations. Ding, 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 ding. So another CIA backed institution, a huge foreign policy organization. And here we go. This is why I wanted to hear. I wanted you to see. From 1972 through 1999, he was a Foreign Service officer in the Department of State. So this person, William Courtney, literally served the Nixon administration all the way to the end of the Clinton administration in the Department of State. And that's where he also served as an ambassador. So this guy is a regime change operative, right? That is who William Courtney is. But we should look at also not just who William Courtney is, because that's important to understanding this whole mentality among the ruling class. There are these plans to conduct regime change against Russia, but we also need to, and I'm just going to close this here. We also need to look at exactly what the RAND Corporation does. So the RAND Corporation is publishing, right? It didn't originate there. It was in the Moscow Times, but it's republishing works from a former Foreign Service officer of the Department of State who specialized in the fall of the Soviet Union and trying to facilitate it. And the RAND Corporation shared it. And you might be wondering, well, why is this? Why is the RAND Corporation so interested in regime change in Russia? Why would they publish a piece that's literally speculating about it and giving underhanded analysis and suggestions on how to get this done in Russia? Well, the RAND Corporation keeps saying that it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, but then it says its research is sponsored by US government agencies, local governments, and all kinds of different sectors of the US society. But if we look at the revenue of $350 million, I mean, that's a huge budget. We look at the percentage of the RAND Corporation's budget, 18.5% goes or comes from the Secretary of Defense and other national security agencies. So basically, the Pentagon here, 18.5%. And that's only second to what you would think is a surprise, the Department of Health and Human Services. But if we take into account that the US Army, 10%, the US Air Force, 13% of the budget, and then the Department of Homeland Security at 14% of the budget, then you have actually over, what is that, 29%? Then you have 42%. So you have over 50% of the budget actually coming from the United States' military arm, its military wing of the government. So that's what the RAND Corporation is. It is a regime change think tank, a military industrial complex think tank funded primarily and principally by the US's military wing of the state. And William Courtney was there to show you that actually the United States is thinking about regime change. The United States government is thinking about it. It's trying to enact it. What William Courtney said there is actually what the United States is doing. It is leveraging sanctions, not necessarily directly on Russia's security industry. However, the sanctions are meant to complement the opposition figures and forces which are supported by the National Endowment for Democracy. So in a way, there is this leveraging of sanctions to support these opposition movements, which are meant to bring about regime change. But he goes a step further and says, no, we need to target the military. And as I've said in past streams, targeting the military, right, gaining a foothold in the military is key and critical to any successful coup, any successful regime change operation under imperialism. That's why in 2014, when the United States successfully sponsored a coup in Ukraine, the military completely changed shape. It began to integrate all these Nazi forces, far-right forces, because that was what was serviceable to the imperialists, right? To do so, to gain control over the military means you gain control over the society. That was the point. That same happened in Chile, right? The same happened all across Latin America and Africa and Asia, right? Anytime that there were coups, there was an attempt to ensure that your guys, your people, were in the military so that the military would become either de facto or directly the ruling party, right? So in Ukraine, it didn't directly become the ruling party, but it is in a sense the ruling party. The military dictates a whole lot of things in Ukraine. And if it didn't, then they wouldn't be pouring all their money into waging a civil war against the Donbass region, right? Uh, uh, that's just how these things go. If you understand anything about imperialism since 1945 alone, then you understand that the military is a key outpost in the post World War II era and the so called Cold War, the post Cold War era. You know that whoever has control of the military, whether it's progressive forces, revolutionary forces, socialist forces, or reactionary imperialists, that determines a lot about the trajectory of the society. That's why Venezuela continues to stand. It has control over the military. The PSUV has popular support inside of the military. It makes up much of the military. Hugo Chavez came from the military, and that's why Venezuela has been able to withstand all these regime change operations. Russia has control over its military. William Courtney admits it so much. That's why they're able to remain independent. China, in a big way, even though its economy is what's talked about a lot, China has control over its defense forces. The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, never stopped being an outgrowth of the Communist Party's just struggle for liberation, right? And eventually toward a revolution in 1949. That never stopped. That institution did not change character, did not become some kind of outpost of imperialism. When the military becomes either an outpost of imperialism, a tool of imperialism, then that's when your country is now a subservient arm of the global diktats of this imperialist system. And that's why William Courtney suggests that the security system in Russia needs to be the target for any kind of successful regime change. So the United States is thinking about this. It is doing this. And this is important to note. Okay. So we need to make sure that we understand the role of the military in society, in imperialist societies, in societies terrorized and overthrown and destabilized by imperialism, and of course, militaries that exist in countries that are independent, right? The Cuban military, the Chinese military, right? These militaries do not have the same problems that, let's say, the military of Ukraine has, because these countries have sovereignty, they have independence, they have self determination. And that is something that we should be defending in regards to Russia and opposing any kind of, whether it's a gaffe by Biden or this example by William Courtney, just completely and overtly talking about regime change from the trough of the military industrial complex. All of that needs to be opposed. So, originally, that article by William Courtney was published in the Moscow Times. And I just want to show you a little bit about who the Moscow Times is. So, the Moscow Times is not a Russia based institution. Actually, the Moscow Times did not have a Russian language version of their paper until 2020. And that was well after they moved out of Russia altogether. There was a lot of controversy because they are an opposition supporting outlet. So they say that they're Russia's leading independent English language media outlet. But if you look at their editor, so I have Samantha Burkhead here, she's located in Western New York. So she's not based in Russia at all. She's worked in DC and other places. All of these figures here, right? They're UK trained, right? Jake Cordell was trained in the UK as an economics correspondent, and he was in Prague for an organization supporting independent media and civil society across the former Soviet Union. So these are literally opposition figures, and they are very open about it. So here you have Michelle being a translator, right? Uh, and writer in Moscow since the Soviet period. Her words worth calling. So she's actually the cultural editor. It's actually based in Russia, but nonetheless, these are all operatives. Look, who they target are Europeans, right? They target Westerners. They don't speak to Russian politics. And if you look at their pages, they just go one after the other with anti-Russia pieces. And so they're not to be taken seriously, but it should be of no surprise that they published someone like William Courtney, which then was funneled through the Rand Corporation. William Courtney, of course, being a State Department operative for much of his career, and now a big shot over at the Rand Corporation, which is a Department of Defense funded and controlled think tank research institution. So with that said, everyone, I think this short analysis alone should tell you all you need to know about the regime change operation of the United States against Russia. That Russia, right? And I'm going to pull up an article by Jackie Luqman in a second. She wrote a good one, a Black Agenda report recently, of direct interference by the United States into Russia's politics, right? This begins with the fall of the Soviet Union. The United States was very happy that that occurred, that it was able to help facilitate that in many ways, whether it was through drawing the Soviet Union into Afghanistan for that proxy war, which ended up being the Soviet Union's Vietnam, according to Zbigniew Brzezinski, right? That whether it was isolating the Soviet Union technologically, whether it was supporting opposition forces, whether it was sanctioning the country, whether it was continuously supporting the overthrow of socialist governments and allies abroad, helping to really escalate the Sino-Soviet split, right, through normalization of relations with China. The United States had a hand in the fall of the Soviet Union, and it was very jovial and happy and celebratory when that occurred. However, it wasn't enough. The Wolfowitz Doctrine came out just after the fall of the Soviet Union and said, okay, the Soviet Union is done. We're at this new period, the end of history. Capitalism is permanent, but we can't allow anything like the Soviet Union to ever occur again. We can't allow for there ever to be a challenger to U.S. hegemony. If we're going to pursue full spectrum dominance, then there can never be another challenger. So Russia, just by its sheer size, its sheer geopolitical and strategic importance, was once again placed on the regime change chopping block once its politics began to shift from shock therapy, gutting the economy from this complete subservient to the West, to a more nationalistic, to a more sovereign model of development. Once that occurred, right, with the leadership of Vladimir Putin, then the ties between the US and Russia began to deteriorate. And that's when this full spectrum dominance, this Wolfowitz doctrine, went into full effect against Russia. And it didn't just start with Putin, though, right? It started with Yeltsin, even. There was an attempt, right? Because Yeltsin was not a popular guy. Boris Yeltsin was a drunk, right? And he had alcoholism, alcohol use disorder. He was unstable. He was not a powerful leader. He did not have much legitimacy in the country. So there was a need for the United States to bolster his support. And so Jackie Luqman wrote about this a couple weeks ago when U.S. soft power meddled in an election in Russia. So we're talking about regime change here. And so there were efforts in Russia to vote in another person, to vote in the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And that's been an ongoing effort by the Communist Party of the Russian Federation since this time. So Jackie Luqman says, I have a little story to tell you. There was this country that had a political leader that they hated. I mean, they hated him. He was an embarrassing bore who drank too much, seemed unable to walk and talk at the same time, and do either one very well independently either. But more importantly to the people, he supported policies that made life much, much harder for regular citizens. Realizing that his virulent unpopularity greatly reduced his chances of winning in the upcoming election for president, the embattled leader begged for help from his backers in another country, who came to the rescue and made sure he was elected, even though the people really did despise the man. The people were genuinely confused about how this man even won because, they hated him so much. But he did. However, all outside help in the world couldn't save the hated leader from himself, and his presidency has gone down in history as the most corrupt and ignominious of all presidents of that country. Now, if you think I'm talking about the US and Trump, think again. I'm talking about Russia and Boris Yeltsin. And this isn't a little story that I made up. It is actually the truth about how the US helped the most hated president of post-Soviet Russia win a re-election campaign that he was not going to win because the people really did hate the man. And why, you wonder, did Russians hate Boris Yeltsin so much? Well, after World War II, the Soviet Union was stretched thin with military interventions in socialist countries that were under threat of attack by capitalist forces, i.e. the U.S. and its allies. The U.S.-led Cold War and the accompanying arms race resulted in the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's a quick and dirty and incomplete assessment, but I hope you get the idea. After Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev didn't handle the restructuring of the Soviet economy very well and introduced unpopular market friendly policies to appease Washington and the West, Boris Yeltsin began maneuvering in the background of Communist Party politics to position himself to challenge a weakened Gorbachev for power. It took him 6 years, but he seized upon the fortuitous efforts of Lithuania to declare their independence from the Soviet bloc to grandstand against Gorbachev publicly, which gave him enough clout in 1991 to persuade a majority of deputies in the Russian parliament to amend the constitution and establish an executive presidency for Russia to be chosen by direct national ballot. And then Yeltsin won that election in a landslide and became the president. So there was a kidnapping of Gorbachev in Crimea by Soviet hardliners, a military junta they sent to Moscow to return the country to central rule, but that failed when the officers of the military in Moscow threw their support behind Yeltsin. Yeltsin then suspended the Russian Communist Party and implemented his own shock doctrine economic reforms. So inflation rose, life got incredibly hard. People started actually dying, right, en masse, and premature deaths, totally preventable deaths. And so there was the dissolution of the parliament under his time as president, right? This real dictatorial kind of manner that this government was running under. And she summarizes that Yeltsin turned his army loose on Parliament in 1993 to really try to bully, right? The Duma was bombed in 1993 in order to ensure that there was no legitimate opposition. So Bill Clinton helped, right? He was called in 1996 because there was this crisis of legitimacy for Yeltsin, and Clinton sent a whole team to manage his reelection campaign. And if you don't believe Jackie Lukman, you can look at the cover. In 1996, they really wanted to stop Gennady Zyuganov, who was going to honestly probably win in 1996 without Bill Clinton's help. So Bill Clinton actually funneled millions of dollars. I don't think that number is here, but millions of dollars went into the Yeltsin campaign in 1996 to help elect him over the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. After all of those disasters, the shock therapy, the bombing of the Duma, the parliamentary building, it was a crisis in Russia. And while the United States didn't facilitate regime change, they ensured that the Russian government remained at least for another 5 years under the thumb of Boris Yeltsin's incompetent shock therapy, pro-Western puppet regime. And so this has a history. So no matter what Antony Blinken says, no matter what the United States says, the corporate media says, they're lying if they tell you that regime change in Russia is not on the table, that's not part of the strategy. You saw that the strategy is actually quite clear. So that's all I have for this particular topic in terms of the coverage from the outside. Okay. So please do like the stream. We're going to continue probably for another 15-20 minutes. Like the stream, share the stream, subscribe to the channel, and be sure if you're able to support my work, you can do so by subscribing monthly at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. You can also subscribe annually to my work at Substack, chroniclesofhaiphong.substack.com. Both of those links are in the description. This week, I have an article coming out on Madeleine Albright and Black Agenda Report, and I will on Wednesday be interviewing Ken Hammond, a China scholar, a longtime director of the Confucius Institute. He's a professor in New Mexico currently, and he will talk about the China Initiative, which I am very excited about talking about because it's something I haven't covered here, but I think the conversation will be very worthwhile. But nonetheless, there you have it. The United States has as its core mission regime change, imperialism, right? Imperialism as a system of monopoly capital that requires compliant governments and compliant states in order to reproduce itself. It needs governments all across the quote unquote developing world, the former colonized world, the ongoing colonized world, in the case of US so called territories in the Asia Pacific, for example, right? That the United States requires governments that serve its interests. And that's how you can tell whether a government is capitalist, whether it's imperialist, whether it's a neo-colony, is how does that government serve the interests of imperialism? Are its interests antagonism to imperialism, right? Because China is in a lot of ways, and even Russia is in a lot of ways, its interests, how it is expressed they are antagonistic to the interests of imperialism. They are not serving the needs of imperialism fully, wholly, or even partially in a lot of ways. And so that's why they are on the chopping block. That's why they are the kind of grand prize for this overall chess game that is being played by the United States and its imperialist allies. They are trying to play what is a dirty and ultimately a pretty incompetent game of chess, where they hopefully can knock out the king and the queen, Russia and China, through all of its foreign policy endeavors. And so when Joe Biden says, I am not for regime change against Russia, he's actually lying. It's not that the United States has this open policy of overthrowing Russia's government today, right? That's certainly not the case, and certainly would not make any sense from a public relations standpoint, from an election standpoint, from the standpoint of the US's so-called exceptionalism, right? That would make the United States actually look like what it is, an imperialist power. So the United States has different ways of going about this that are more subtle, that are harder to discern to the naked eye, and for people who aren't necessarily paying attention to these developments and are not paying attention to US-Russia relations over the past several decades, who are not paying attention to this overall geopolitical landscape, who are not paying attention to the rise of China, how the United States has treated China, and are not paying attention to how the United States has waged war after war after war and is waging war after war after war around the world over the last 70 plus years since the end of World War II. There's a lot of people who just haven't paid attention to this. And even when they were opposed to the war in Vietnam, they were really only opposed because American soldiers were dying out in the war. And once the draft ended, they stopped opposing wars, right? And the same thing happened during the anti-war protests against the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Those protests ended when the United States changed the color and changed the party of its political system. When Obama came into power, then that war was okay because it was no longer Bush's dumb wars, right? So the United States has a lot of ways of sanitizing and propagandizing about its endless war regime and its endless pursuit of regime change in order to get us in thinking it isn't doing this. And so one of the complicated things that has happened is that Russia responded to all of these provocations. Russia responded to NATO expansion. Russia responded to everything that was happening in Ukraine, all of the ways in which the United States and the West was supporting Ukraine. And it responded by coming to the aid of Donbass and waging this military operation, which focuses on Donbass. People, we need to get this. It is not a war to occupy Ukraine, to destroy everything about Ukraine, to wipe Ukraine off the map. That is not what this operation has ever been about. It has been about coming to the aid of the Donetsk People's Republic, Lugansk People's Republic, which inevitably means taking out military installations everywhere throughout the country, because those military installations are supporting the siege on Donbass. So that is what has happened. That is why there's so much confusion about this war. And that's why we have an even harder environment, more difficult environment to navigate, because a lot of people are watching the corporate media and saying Russia's doing this offensive invasion. It is destroying Ukraine. It is completely crippling Ukraine. It is all about destroying Ukraine, because that's what we're told over and over and over again, without any sort of thought or reflection on, well, how about the United States' own record here? What is the United States' role? What is NATO's role? How is the United States facilitating this kind of phenomenon in development? Because it has, and it continues to do so. Joe Biden going to Poland, a NATO country which is right on Russia's doorstep, a country that Russia has said over and over and over again is playing a dangerous game, and that the military operations there, the weapons of mass destruction stationed there, the U.S. troops, thousands of U.S. troops are in Poland right now, that all of that is a dangerous provocation with Russia, and Russia has said so over and over and over again. But Joe Biden's decision during this conflict to go to Poland and to then say this, regardless of whether it's a gaffe or not, then to say this man, Putin, cannot remain in power, is one of the most chilling things, I think, that has come out of his administration. Because not only does it expose the US's agenda right? Because this is the US's agenda. US's agenda was not to just to play nice with Russia and to just keep it nice and small. No, it's always been to obliterate and destabilize Russia by destabilizing the planet. Same with China. Destabilize the planet, you destabilize China. So not only does it expose that agenda, but it also exposes the incompetence of the Joe Biden regime, of his administration. It just goes to show that the empire is really naked right now, that the United States is openly funneling weapons into Ukraine, openly starving Russia, saying that these are acts of quote unquote democracy and supporting liberty and freedom against tyranny and all of this, openly comparing warmongering policies and equating them with democracy and peace and all of this, right? We have an open admission from the Biden administration that it believes that sanctions actually help redistribute wealth to people rather than destroy countries, plunder wealth, and actually cause thousands upon thousands of premature deaths. We have this rhetoric being spread by the Joe Biden administration. To me, it signals a really ineffective, really incompetent regime, something that I don't think I could imagine this happening during the Obama administration. If there's one thing the Obama administration could do, is they could make US imperialism out to be a more effective evil. I think that Joe Biden actually has not necessarily done himself any favors with how he's responded to the Russia Ukraine conflict. Actually, he's just thrown more gasoline onto the fire. Now you have food shortages, inflation. Now you have all this economic uncertainty that is spreading across the country. It's quite the scene, right? It is quite the scene. This is a real problem for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, which is only has a razor thin majority in Congress, which it hasn't even used anyway, right? Its popularity is not very high. It hasn't skyrocketed since it has basically placed itself as some kind of quote unquote leader of the free world and is really at the vanguard of some kind of movement for democracy against Russia's autocracy, right? It hasn't really spiked Joe Biden's popularity. And that's because people in the United States are pretty miserable right now. Life is very stressful. Capitalism is in crisis. Most working people are having a really difficult time economically. The racial cleavages in the United States of society are not improving. You have women, Chinese women, lining up in Chinatown in New York City, lining up around blocks to pick up pepper spray because they don't trust that this government can protect them. There's all this talk about, oh, we need more police to protect Chinese and Asian Americans from violence, racist violence in this country. And now we're seeing and hearing that no, the cops aren't to be trusted either because they're not doing anything to help. And lo and behold, that's something that I and a lot of others predicted that more law enforcement can only exacerbate problems like this. But nonetheless, this is kind of the scene in the United States. It is really a catastrophe. It is a slow rolling, stagnating catastrophe internally, politically unstable. You have economic policies that only benefit the rich. You have racial cleavages worsening, whether it's the anti Asian racism or the complete and utter erasure of the very problems that Joe Biden said he was going to address, right? Oh, we're going to reform the police against racist because of racist policing. And then what does he say? Oh, no, no, no. We're not defunding the police. We're funding the police. We're going to fund the police more, right? So this attention to mass incarceration that was received during the uprisings, the protests, Black Lives Matter 2014, 2020, has gone out the window too. The militarization of the police, the state of undocumented immigrants stuck in the tens of thousands in these detention centers, right? Uh, Asylum seekers being turned back and many being deported, all of these issues, right? Joe Biden's deportation regime, his detention regime against immigrants, that hasn't received any attention either. So you have all of these cleavages and conflicts and contradictions and antagonism just festering, right? Just simmering under the surface as Joe Biden continues to be this placeholder presidency that doesn't really have an agenda that serves anybody and except for the rich, right? Except for the ruling class. And now you have this historic Russia-Ukraine conflict. You have Russia stepping up to the plate and saying, no, We're not going to be bullied and provoked anymore. We are going to take care of business. Regardless of whatever you think of that, that is exactly what the mentality was. And it has changed the course of history. And now we're in a completely different, I believe, a different course of history, one that isn't characterized by some kind of just a vacillating new Cold War where you have China and Russia just trying to build relations, trying to build a peaceful multipolar world. But you actually have now scenarios and situations being developed and being actively facilitated, which require Russia and, well, I don't see this happening with China on the horizon, but you do have scenarios like Taiwan, right? Xinjiang, all of these, which require China also to be more forthright and forward in how they defend their sovereignty. And Russia, I believe, will probably have more and more of these similar kind of problems, regardless of what happens in Ukraine, because of the situation with Poland, because of the situation with the three Soviet republics on its borders, former Soviet republics like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, right? Ukraine is not going to stop being a problem. I don't think the United States is going to just let go of Ukraine and its influence over it just because there's some kind of deal brokered, maybe perhaps in the near future. I do believe that Russia is going to be in a battle and in a fight for quite a long time, and we're going to have to continuously synthesize and understand what position we take on this. And while I do think it is okay for now for those on the peace movement to say, well, because of all that's happened, because of the propaganda, because it's hard to know what's going on, because it's hard to know about intentions, I think it's okay to have an overall stance of we just want peace. And while we don't side with the war or anyone in it, we understand Russia's position. That's okay for now. But I think the larger problem here is that we have to continue to sharpen our analysis of contradictions and understand what the principal contradiction is. And that means saying that actually NATO caused this war, actually the United States and the imperialists caused this war, and they are to blame for any scenario that should escalate in this region that involves Russia. Because Russia, regardless of what you think of its government, of its economy, Russia does not have a history of being the aggressor. This Chechnya, the Georgia, these wars, they were rife with contradiction. There were really a lot of things happening in Chechnya and in Georgia that were not so great and that did create a lot of concerns for Russia, right? There was terrorism in Chechnya on the borders. There was a lot of interference in Chechnya. Georgia was considering getting closer to the West and was doing a whole lot economically and politically that I don't think any country would tolerate on its borders. And so there was a lot of nuance to these things. And the same goes for Ukraine. So we have to understand that the reason for instability in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union is because the United States and the larger imperialist system has facilitated this chaos, has facilitated this kind of instability. And we have to be the ones to not just call it out, not just say that we're against it, but we have to actively be figuring out how do we stop this? We need to stop this. This is preposterous. This is not anything conducive to a peaceful world, to a world where people can live and have their needs met. If you're a socialist or a communist, then you have to have a militant kind of peace, an anti-imperialist kind of peace movement. It cannot just be we want pacifism. That's not going to work in a world where imperialism is strangling, destroying, and trying to subdue countries via the gun. What did Mao say? You need to pick up the gun to get rid of the gun, right? That's what Huey Newton said too. And that's what's going to happen. That's why China has this a huge defense system. That's why it has a military. It's not as big as the United States is, but it has a strong military. The same goes for the DPRK. The same goes for any country that's truly sovereign right now. If you do not have a strong military that can defend the country, then you're going to be ripe for regime change. And that's what countries that do have sovereignty right now in the so-called developing world and the so-called former colonized world and the world of the so-called third world, the former imperialist countries, that's what they have. They need to have strong militaries. They need to be able, right? The DPRK needs to be able to show the West and the United States that if it is messed with militarily by South Korea and its US forces and back forces there, that there will be consequences. So that's why you have these tests, these intercontinental missile tests, right? You have these because the DPRK needs to do that. If it doesn't do that and it shows that it's weak, then it has 10,000 plus troops just beyond the demarcation zone, the DMZ, that are ready, that do have access to potentially nuclear weapons at a minute's notice, right? With the backing of the United States. So this is the world that we live in. We can't be idealistic. We have to understand that the world that we live in is one that is characterized by war, by class war, by imperialist war, and we need to get on the side. We need to get on the side of peace, but it cannot be a pacifist peace. This is not a pacifist moment. We can't, pacifism has its role, and certainly material conditions could change, but we have to be militant. We have to be on the side. We can't just say, oh, we're against all violence, we're against this, we're against Chris Rock being slapped, but we're for a no-fly zone, right? We can't be on that side. We have to be on the side of, well, we are for countries that defend themselves from imperialism. We're for Palestinians' right to defend themselves from Zionism, settler colonialism. We're for the people of Yemen defending themselves against Saudi invasion and imperialism, right? We need to be for that. We need to stand with those forces, and we need to say that you do have the right to exist, right? First and foremost, you do have the right to exist, to defend yourself from state violence, from imperialist violence. That is, I think, the principal contradiction of our time right now. And it is showing its face and it's showing its head with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but it's everywhere, right? And it's part of the US's obsession with regime change. So I need to go, but I appreciate that you all came for this quick stream. Please do like the stream, share the stream before you go, subscribe to the channel before you go, and please do consider supporting the channel, supporting all of my work at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. I do admit that the tax man is coming for my money because of all the great support that you've given me. And it's unfortunate, but that's just the way it goes for us who are trying to do this work independently. So please do continue to support the channel, continue to help defray some of these costs, whether it's streaming, continue to write and putting in that labor. I really do appreciate it. So whatever amount you can, please do support this work at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. All right, everybody. With that said, it was really good to be with you today. Make sure that you continue to like the stream and boost it out. I'll come out with clips. I got a lot of clips to catch up to. But Wednesday, I will be on with Ken Hammond at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So set your date. Be on. We'll talk about the China initiative. I got to refresh on that topic myself. So I look forward to it. Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. Peace out. And I will see you on Wednesday. Bye-bye.